In this lecture, we're going to be discussing Zen philosophy and Zen art, and its effects on American art in the mid-20th century. After all that esoteric symbolism and color theory in the last lectures, I thought it would be a nice change to look at a philosophy that releases all of the heavy symbolism we've been studying. An Indian monk named Bodhidharma is seen as the first patriarch of Zen Buddhism. He traveled from India to China around 520 AD, and he brought with him what was called Chan, C-H-A-N. Chan was based on the Sanskrit word dhyana, which means meditation. Now, the Chinese philosophy of Taoism had many similarities to Chan, and so therefore many Taoists in China became interested in Chan, and they influenced its development in China with Taoist beliefs. As this new philosophy from India was assimilated into Chinese culture, Chan incorporated both Taoist and Confucian belief systems. At the end of the 12th century, Chinese monks introduced Chan into Japan, and the samurai and shoguns and the ruling class in Japan supported the views of Chan and promoted it. In Japan, Chan was termed Zen, which is a word that is derived from the Japanese verb zazen, which means to sit or to meditate. Over the centuries, Zen, or Zen Buddhism, has been divided into several main schools, but the two most important schools in Japan are Rinzai Zen and Soto Zen. Rinzai Zen considers the arts an important aspect of the practice, while Soto Zen focuses entirely on meditation. Many of our artists were influenced by Rinzai Zen art, and also by a monk named Daisetsu T. Suzuki, who wrote numerous books and articles on Zen, and he also gave lectures on Zen at many of the universities in America. In the philosophy of Zen, everyday activities are art. Therefore, activities such as tea-making, flower arranging, archery, and swordsmanship were cultivated as artistic practices. The physical component of these arts alleviated the opposition of the mind versus the body, and instead it incorporated the mind and the body, helping them to work together. Sumi-e, a type of Rinzai Zen painting that centers around simplified brushstrokes, was another art that was cultivated in China and Japan. Sumi-e literally means black ink painting, and it eschews the use of color and shading in order to avoid creating realism. The painter is like a meditator who allows the brush to move without forethought and without premeditation. There is no planning and no retouching, no erasing and no repetition. The painter transmits their inspiration as swiftly as possible to the paper. In order to begin painting these sumi-e paintings, the monks who produced these works would enter into a meditative state before they began. The meditative state was focused by simple acts of preparing the inkstone and grinding the sumi ink, by loading the brush, and then releasing the brushstroke on rice paper or a silk scroll. Within sumi-e, the aesthetics of asymmetry, simplicity, naturalness, and tranquility were valued. This resulted in images that can seem very simplified, with a lot of white or empty space as an integral part of the painting. Sometimes the result can be very still and tranquil. Other times, it can be splashy with a lot of movement. To our eyes, the final product may even seem cartoonish. Whatever the result, the artist was supposed to transmit an inspiration only when they had undergone a profound understanding of the subject. In this next quote, Suzuki relays why the sumi-e painter does not gravitate towards realism. He says, "However faithfully a painter may try to remind us of an object of nature as it is, the result can never do justice to it. The Sumi-e artist thus reasons, why not altogether abandon such an attempt? Let us instead create living objects out of our own imagination. As long as we all belong to the same universe, our creations may show some correspondence to what we call objects of nature. Before we begin by looking at modern-day artists who were influenced by the Sumi-e painting, let's begin with understanding more about Zen Buddhism and its philosophy. An important characteristic of Zen is the practice of Zazen. Zazen meditation is a practice that focuses around the breath. It promotes sitting and breathing and being in the here and now, experiencing whatever internal or external state you are experiencing, whether it is scattered thoughts or just noticing that you are cold. But the idea is to keep bringing back your awareness to the breath. In fact, Dogen, and I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that name correctly, it may be Dogen, the founding monk of Soto Zen, said that during meditation you should just sit. Sit without any expectation. Do not expect enlightenment. Do not expect anything. Because to expect anything is to desire it, to hope for it, and to want for it, and that is an experience of the ego. The mind wants to start meditation because it's seeking an answer to a problem, or it's seeking an escape from life. Problems and conflicts are what start us on the path of seeking, and that's what leads us to meditation. But in the end, when you do the meditation, the idea is to not seek, to not expect, to not hope for anything, to just be. To me, Zen and Zazen sound like a philosophy where you just accept the present moment. It sounds like you try to live in a present state first and foremost. In a typical Zen paradox, one monk said, Zazen meditation is good for nothing. Zen also teaches a concept called total function, which is a bit difficult to explain, but I think makes the most sense through a story. A Zen master asked his student, when a bell rings, is it the wind that rings the bell that makes the sound? Or is it the bell that makes the sound? So which is it, the wind or the bell? And the student answered, it is my mind that makes the sound. The wind causes the bell to shake, which causes the metal to hit and sends the vibration out in the air, but it is my mind that causes the sound. Sound is only inside of the mind. And I'm sure the student thought he was being very clever. But the master said, that is not true. It is not just your mind, because even if your mind was working, if the wind did not blow and the bell did not ring, you wouldn't have heard anything. All of these things are making the sound. The entire universe is making the sound. So, there is no object that is making the sound, and there is no person listening to the sound. We are all part of everything. We are just a tiny part of it, but collectively we are integrated. Another example is if you go outside and you hear birds singing. If you think to yourself, oh, birds are singing, that's not Zen. Thinking, describing, and labeling what is happening is not experiencing it. It separates you from the birds. The total function is that everything is a part of the whole, and everything is working collectively as one. If this concept seems too hard to understand, and at the same time seems too simplistic, welcome to Zen. In a way, I see the Zen that we're studying in this class as repairing the kind of dualism that spiritualism and theosophy taught. Within those concepts, there was this heavy emphasis on there being two worlds, the physical world and the spiritual world. And if you remember, there were all those different planes of existence, the physical world, the astral plane, the mental plane, the Buddhic plane, and this idea that everything was dividing more and more individualistically as creation went on. But with Zen art, I think there's like a hearkening to go back to unification, to seeing the world as whole, to recognizing the divides but not trying to label or name them. In fact, logical thought and dualism are felt to be obstacles in the process leading to enlightenment, according to Zen. In my own words, Zen is a kind of anti-everything, and you come to know what Zen is by knowing what it is not. Dogmas are rejected, and there is no holy book to guide believers, and this is why it's difficult to define Zen. It's not really a religion or a philosophy. Zen, in order to break through the logical thought and get you to experience the unification, uses irrationality or paradoxical thoughts. Since you can't think your way into enlightenment, Zen uses what is called a koan as a spiritual tool to transcend rational experience. A koan is an irrational question or an unanswerable question, something that puzzles the student. It can also be a short story that poses a riddle or puzzle to the student. An example of a koan is, what is the sound of one hand clapping? Another example is, take hold of a plow with empty hands. How? By defying any rational explanation, these questions throw a wrench in your critical thinking. Your analytical thoughts grind to a halt and are subsumed with only experiencing the self. In this way, the questions direct you towards experience and away from logical, rational analysis. Koans are actually intended to be answered, and there are supposedly correct answers to many of these riddles. But the fact is that there may be many correct answers, not just one. The real purpose of the Buddhist koan is to communicate the non-dualistic nature of the world. By not being able to logically resolve the opposing meanings, the student is able to see that the world is a whole, and that the cognitive mind's tendency to separate and label the world is futile. Okay, so we know that the state of Satori, or enlightenment, is often achieved as a result of zazen, or meditation. But what is Satori, or enlightenment, according to Zen? Zen is very much focused on the here and now. And therefore, Satori simply means insight into the true being. Satori is only possible to obtain by intensely feeling practical and personal experiences. So it's the experience of concrete things from everyday life that is particularly important. Satori, or enlightenment, can be experienced and achieved even through the mundane tasks, and especially through the mundane tasks of washing dishes, or of sweeping the floor, or of picking the garden. One Zen proverb that best describes their attitude towards enlightenment says, "Before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water." Externally, nothing has changed, but it's the internal state that has changed. Satori is the insight into the true being. It's basically know thyself. It's knowing yourself, it's being completely comfortable with yourself, it's understanding how you fit into everything in the world, and it's a kind of peace or tranquility that you find by not trying to do anything, or by not desiring or hoping or wanting or, pushing yourself against the world. It sounds almost like a state of complete acceptance. They say that once Satori or enlightenment has been obtained, the world is experienced from a new, fresh point of view. It's seen in its wholeness. In this way, you can understand enlightenment as an attitude or an outlook, not as a change of circumstance or as an ascension into heaven. Enlightenment seems to be more than just a centering of the mind. It seems to be a new state of being that is always present within one as you experience the world. I wonder if Swedenborg's idea of heaven being an internal state is similar to Satori or enlightenment. Enlightenment is considered a cohesive state of being. So both the psyche and the body are aligned in unity, harmony, and purpose. The mind isn't fighting the body. Different parts of the mind aren't warring with each other. You know how sometimes you are in a state of worry and it feels like you have two different minds and they seem to be attacking each other. This split in human consciousness is portrayed in cartoons with the devil sitting on one shoulder and an angel sitting on the other shoulder. However, with Satori, the self is at peace. A common parable within Zen that illustrates Satori is the parable of the ox and its herdsmen. Artists often portray this parable in a series of 10 pictures. The first picture and the last picture are almost the same. They simply depict a man walking. The 8 intervening pictures show the man taming the ox. And during this time of him taming the ox, he achieves enlightenment. A completely empty frame shows the stage when the ox herder reaches enlightenment. But if we look at the whole series of painting, the last picture matches the first picture, showing that though it seems nothing has changed, the man is now aware of the here and now. The feeling of unity with nature is also very important to Zen. This primarily amounts of an awareness that man himself is also part of nature. This is not promoting a primitive or primal attitude or going back to prehistoric ways of living. The Zen master has a limited role on the path towards enlightenment when he teaches his students. He has nothing to really teach his pupils. Everyone must teach themselves from their own inner being. There's a story of the Zen master who always raised a finger, and in reply to one of his students who raised their finger, he chopped off the finger of the student. The student was said to have achieved Satori immediately afterwards. He chopped the finger of the student off because there was no creative originality. The pupil simply imitated him. Where there is no creative originality, there can be no Zen. And this idea of individuality and experience promoted by Zen, you can see why it would have appealed to many artists. Promoting the highly personal nature of experience would allow the artist a philosophy or a way to work with great freedom of personal expression. In Zen, there is also the concept of emptiness and nothingness. These two things do not mean the absence of something, but are complete in themselves. What it means is that empty is also full, and nothing is also something. Suzuki writes, "All things have the character of emptiness. They have no beginning, no end. They are faultless and not faultless. They are not perfect and not imperfect. Here in this emptiness there is no form, no perception, no name, no concepts, no knowledge, no sound, no smell, no taste, no object, no touch." And if you watch the video with Agnes Martin, you will hear her talk about this empty mind, or having an empty and receptive mind that is open to anything. An example about the importance of having an empty mind is a story that goes something like this. A Japanese master received a university professor who came to inquire about Zen. the master served tea to this professor. He poured his visitor's cup full, and then he kept on pouring. The professor, meanwhile, was talking about himself and what he knew about Zen. He was trying to impress the Japanese master. The professor watched as the cup began to overflow until he could no longer restrain himself. "It is overfull," he said. "No more will go in." The master said, "Like this cup, you are full of your own opinions and speculations. How can I show you Zen unless you first empty your cup?" So this is a popular koan that focuses on the value of learning, unlearning, and relearning. It challenges us to free ourselves from our rigid thinking. In order for us to make space for new things and experiences, we have to let go of things we already know. However, the reality is that it's nearly impossible to forget what you have learned, and that is where the paradox lies. What we learn will always be retained in some capacity, like in your subconscious mind and your muscle memory. When you pour out what you have learned from the cup of your mind, you are actually letting go of the attachment of your ego to that memory or to that knowledge. This challenges you to release rigid views, opinions, and expectations. A very famous quote is, "In Zen, we don't find the answers, we lose the questions." Zen found its way to America because in the 19th century, the Western world started to take note of Eastern philosophy, religion, and art. We already know from a previous lecture that Helena Blavatsky, the founder of Theosophy, was instrumental in transmitting many foundational Eastern concepts, like reincarnation and karma. Because she was instructed by Indian masters who appeared to her in visions or through written letters, and because she studied in Tibet, the idea of having a spiritual guide or a guru was also transmitted to the West. It wasn't only Blavatsky. Japan had maintained 2 centuries of cultural and economic seclusion by closing itself off from trade with the rest of the world. But in the 1850s, political powers shifted in Japan, and it opened its borders to trading with the US, with Britain, and other Western cultures. What ensued was a kind of fascination with Japanese culture and art in Europe and America. People were being exposed to a culture that had such different standards for its art and such different values for its customs that Westerners were intrigued. The great interest in Japan, especially among Parisians, was termed Japonism. Artists like Van Gogh venerated the flatness found in Japanese woodblock prints, and he incorporated this flatness into his own art. Kandinsky was also influenced by exhibits of Japanese woodcuts. He incorporated the simplistic woodcut style in his Blue Rider Almanac, and he praised Eastern art as having an inner tone or inner sound that is lacking in the West. The interest in Zen Buddhism began to be cultivated in the 1920s when a Zen Buddhist monk whom we've already quoted, Daisetsu Suzuki, began publishing essays on Zen and lecturing at Columbia University. Artists, academics, and many intellectuals were particularly interested in these lectures and readings, and there were many artistic groups that met together to discuss these philosophies on a regular basis, including the artist group called The Club. The Club was a meeting place for New York City artists who expressed themselves in the abstract expressionist manner, and it functioned from around the 1940s to the 1950s. So let's take a look at some of the art that was generated by artists who were interested in these Zen Buddhist philosophies. One such artist was Mark Tobey, and he was a New York City painter who painted from the 1910s up until the 1970s. He traveled throughout Europe, America, and the East, even visiting China and Japan during his lifetime. One of his main objectives that he sought to fulfill through his painting was a unification of both Eastern and Western philosophies. He had become interested in a Middle Eastern religion called Baha'i, which promoted the unification of East and West, much like Zen Buddhism promoted seeing all things as one. Tobey had read a very popular book of the 1930s called Zen Buddhism and Its Relation to Art, in which the relationship between the one and the many is explained. He was also friends with many other artists who were introducing Eastern art into Western society. For example, he knew Bernard Leach quite well, and Bernard Leach was a famous ceramicist who brought Japanese ceramics to the West. Tobey was also friends with a Chinese artist named Tang Kui. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing this name correctly either. And Tang Kui taught him Oriental brush techniques. Tobey said that that was what caused him to discover the difference between mass and a living line. He realized that what he had been describing before through art was just a mass of a tree. But now it became an energetic rhythm. He also traveled with Bernard Leach to Shanghai and to Japan, where he spent a month in a Zen monastery learning about calligraphy, Japanese painting, and Zen. He claimed that he only really knew what painting was after his stay in Japan. He called the lines in his painting moving lines, so mobile, alive, and animated. He felt that using the brush was a way of becoming mentally liberated. His works, which are based around these lines, are called white writings, as they consist of layers of lines nestled and vibrating on top of each other, usually transitioning from a darker to a lighter value on top. Most of his works feature a mass of these living lines. Sometimes these lines feel calligraphic, sometimes they feel like a web. They remind me of biological processes, of neurons communicating with each other, of nerve impulses. That is just my personal interpretation of them. Sometimes they feel like graffiti or scribbles, something ephemeral and not important. Other times they seem to hint at a code, something symbolic or encrypted. It's interesting because the way that the lines work together speaks of a living, breathing mass or organism. I think we can see this kind of total function in the way that the lines are creating something together, and how a mass is at once a whole living, breathing system. Some of these white writings are titled New York, and therefore they show the perpetual motion of the city, the eternally changing landscape around him. Tobey himself said of his art, "I want vibration in it. Everything that exists, every human being, is a vibration." He was trying to create a living painting, not a dead one. His friend Tang Kui was instrumental in opening Tobey's eyes to a way of painting that was all about dynamism and movement, not just about mass, form, value, and shading. Tobey's work seems to be very influenced by a Sumi-e style of painting called Sesshu painting, or splashed ink painting, that results in a kind of quivering dynamic. And just like Sumi-e painters used no color to sometimes a very limited palette, Tobey works with mostly black and white. If we are looking for an artist who turned painting into a Zen riddle, then we can look at Ad Reinhardt, another New York City artist who is famous for his black paintings. He taught Eastern art history, particularly Chinese, Japanese, and Indian art, at Brooklyn College for many years. And he lamented that East Asian art was not accorded a worthy place in the art history world of the West. He considered Zen painting one of the greatest achievements in art and human history. He attended Suzuki's lectures in the early 50s, and he also read Zen Buddhism and its relation to art, just like Mark Tobey. Despite all of his participation with Zen philosophies and his knowledge of Asian art, he never explicitly compared his art to Asian art, and he never explicitly referenced Zen Buddhism as an influence in his art. Therefore, some art historians have been hesitant to say how much of an influence Zen philosophies actually were on his art. But it seems apparent to me that the Zen approach molded much of his artwork. For example, his black paintings are like a koan riddle themselves. They are almost completely black, sometimes varying shades of black, painted in systematic grids. They have a matte, non-reflective surface, and there is no brushwork evident. Could they even be considered paintings? In the way that Zen philosophy has an easier time describing what it is not, these paintings are a reduction of painting until it is reduced to being a painting that is not. In typical Zen "you can't label me" fashion, Reinhardt says this: "It's been said many times in art writing that one can find some of painting's meanings by looking not only at what painters do, but at what they refuse to do. And today, many artists like myself refuse to be involved in some ideas. In painting, for me, there is no fooling the eye, no window hole in the wall, no illusions, no representations, no associations, no distortions, no paint caricaturings, no divine inspiration or daily perspiration, no romantic bait, no experiments, no rules, no anarchy." Reinhardt also wrote down some rules for paintings, and in these rules he advised using no texture, no brushwork, no calligraphy, no drawing or sketching, no design, no colors, no light, no space, and no subject or matter. I would go on, but I think you get the point about his philosophy. Actually, all of these statements are very similar to the Zen Buddhist sutra called the Sunyata Sutra, that speaks on the nature of emptiness. Part of the Sunyata Sutra says, "Here, in this emptiness, there is no form, no perception, no name, no concepts, no knowledge." So I think we can see how similar this sutra about complete emptiness is to Reinhardt's artist statement. Reinhardt painted more than just black squares. He painted squares of blue and of red too. Most of the canvases share such subtle value shifts that the eye has trouble separating the colors. More than an optical illusion, it crosses the barrier into being a brain illusion. The brain begins to question, to try to interpret. The brain tries to pin down the colors and where they belong, but their similarity in shade and tone evade any pinning. Instead, the more you try to figure out the why of these paintings, the more you are befuddled. Why would a man spend his days painting paintings whose differentials are so small that staring at them is either fascinating or so boring that it makes you comatose? In that way, his paintings present a riddle that the brain has a hard time solving. Thus, the logical centers are turned off, and one begins to stare, to just be. I believe this is what Reinhardt was trying to accomplish, for you to just be with his paintings, without any interpretation. I would say that you could have an experience, but he would probably list no experience as part of the experience. These paintings are labeled by the art establishment as minimalist paintings due to their minimal color and subject matter. if they could be said to have any subject matter. They are also sometimes referred to as field paintings because they are simply fields of colors. Viewing them as fields of color can lead them to have an expansive nature or an infinite nature. The field feels endless, like it could expand forever, and the subtle cross shape draws you into this endless center too. I would talk more about these paintings, but there's not a lot to talk about, honestly, and that doesn't seem to be the point of the paintings. One of Ad Reinhardt's dearest friends was another famous painter named Agnes Martin, and she originally began with painting abstract surrealist paintings while living in Taos, New Mexico. But after being discovered by a New York City gallery owner, she moved to the Big Apple and made connections with other American abstract artists. While she was in New York, she adopted a grid pattern, which allowed her to focus on completely non-representational art. The organic shapes of the Southwest disappeared, and grids or stripes with muted colors replaced them. Her colors usually stayed within ranges of soft pastel grays, blues, and reds, and she employed a variety of materials in her creations. Originally, she worked more with oil paints. Later, she switched to acrylic and graphite pencils. She often worked with printing methods too, like lithography. Working off of a grid within her paintings allowed her freedom from shape or form. It provided a framework without providing any representational subject matter. And this was preferable to Martin because she said she painted with her back to the world. She was known to just sit and stare at the canvas, to sit and wait before she began any creation. She would wait for a vision that was completely and fully finished to come to her before she would begin working. Once the inspiration manifested, she would work quickly. But if there were too many mistakes or drips of paint that weren't supposed to be there, she would destroy the canvas and start over. Sometimes this would happen several times before a finished painting would be birthed. She was very close to Ad Reinhardt, and his death from a heart attack in 1967, alongside her own mental health concerns, prompted Martin to move back to the desert, where she gave up painting for a time and instead worked with writing and filmmaking. Later in life, she re-entered the art scene, making her signature large pastel paintings that now included more yellows and roses, although the colors still remained quite soft and she was still working with stripes or bands of color. There is something of a desert glow in these paintings, as if the southwestern sun were setting behind them and bleaching the sand in its brilliance. The paintings are hard to capture with a camera, and they're hard to see on a computer screen. However, I have seen some of her later works from the 90s, specifically the paintings with alternating blue and yellow bands. I can say that in person, they have quite an effect on you. I tried to meditate on them while I was in their presence, and I could feel the tranquility that had been imbued in them. In a way, gazing at them allowed me to feel like I was truly resting. John Cage is the last artist I'd like us to look at today, and he is quite different from the three previous artists, because he was both a visual artist and a musician. He was part of the club in New York City and had a personal acquaintance with Daisetsu Suzuki. Cage had been having emotional and personal problems in his life around the time he met Suzuki. He was in his mid-40s, right around the time people have a midlife crisis, and he felt like his music was disconnected from the audience, and that the audience was disconnected from the music he was making. So Cage began applying the ideas of Zen within his music, making the audience active participants instead of passive listeners. He said he was trying to wake people up to the very life that they were living. In 1952, he created a work he is most well known for. It is called 433, and it is a piece of music in which the pianist comes out onto the stage, sits down at the piano, lifts the lid, and waits 4 minutes and 33 seconds without playing a single note, then closes the lid and walks off stage. The sounds that the audience makes in anticipation or in unrest are what comprises the recording of 433. In this work, we see another example of how emptiness or negation of what we expect brings awareness. Just like Ad Reinhardt's paintings, the lack of any discernible object or sound for our mind to play with forces us to just be and to just experience the moment. In many of Cage's performances, he used everyday objects and sounds in order to remove the boundary between life and art. For example, in his performance, Water Walk, he uses commonplace objects to make a musical composition. He times the entire performance as he walks to and fro on stage, lifting the tops off steaming pots to create hissing noises or squeezing a rubber duck to create squeaks. The sequence of the sounds seems rather random to us, but his serious demeanor and the ticking of the watch make it seem very important in how the objects are played. The audience laughs and giggles, and their response becomes part of the music. In a way, the very serious nature with which he plays with all these objects is quite amusing. And the word play is key here. He's playing with the audience, and he's playing with the objects. There's a sense of light-hearted absurdity to it all. Cage hosted and performed in many other events that had a similar nature as Water Walk. Many of these events do not have any recording, and therefore it is only the subjective recollections of people who were there that can inform us. The nature of experience being so personal and so universal is a very Zen thing. In conclusion, the incorporation of Zen philosophy and Zen art within 20th century American art contains many more examples than just these 4 artists. However, I believe that this is a good beginning for understanding how Zen and modern art intertwine. We can see that the artists themselves acted like monks, using meditation as a state to unlock inspiration. Artists negated everything they embraced before, and they allowed the Zen concept of emptiness to fill up their works, to create art that is still perplexing and tickles our curiosity today.